So thank you for joining us today, and I know we've meant to do it like last week and whatever, but a few problems along the way, but here we are. So yeah, we might as well get straight into it as we mean to go on. So you've been in this industry a lot longer than us, obviously.
a lot longer, yes.
Yeah. Where did it start out for you? So when you were like 16, was you working at 16, or was you doing jobs beforehand? Was you like on the market 14, or was you just starting at 16?
Well, there was a bit of newspaper delivery work going on, and I worked as a barman a bit. That was when I was a student, so I worked at Gatwick Airport actually. As a barman for a couple of summers, which was quite fun. And actually the terminal that I worked in is now, I think, the North Terminal, because at the time there was only one terminal, which takes us quite a long way back. So I did a bit of that, but I didn't actually explore anything journalistic until towards the end of my time as a student. So it was newspaper delivering and serving pints of beer.
I bet you were serving pints of beer at all times of the morning.
Well, I was actually, and that was another rare thing, because the bar was in the departure lounge, so none of the normal rules applied as existed back then, because they were far more restrictive licensing rules then than there are now. But yeah, we were open 24 hours in theory, so people on their way to some exotic foreign destination could come in and have a drink at any time of the day or night, and many did.
I'm sure that, I mean, well, so even today, I think people go away on holiday, don't they? Go, should we have a drink before we get on the plane? And it's like, yeah, just the one. Was you doing that whilst you was like at college, or was it just part-time?
I did it in the summer holidays, because I was a student at University of Leicester, where I read English, and during the summer holidays, 2 successive summers, I got a job there for, I think it was 8 weeks out of the full duration of those summer holidays. It was quite close to where I lived, because I was living in South London or Surrey at the time, so it wasn't too far to travel. And the shifts were either, I think they began at 7 in the morning and finished at 3 p.m, or they began at 3 p.m. and finished at 11 p.m, so you could kind of make it work. And compared to quite a lot of summer holiday jobs, it wasn't bad actually. So yeah, I quite enjoyed it.
Yeah, seems nice little job. So whilst you were at like college and everything else, would you say you'd quite like an academic student, or was it kind of just going through the motions of, right, you finished high school into college? Did you have a plan? Obviously not like, a nailed down plan of, I'm going to go and become this or do that. Would you say you was quite like a in-depth researching student, or just taking things as they came?
I worked reasonably hard. I mean, I got a lot of my friends who did other degrees were quite scathing about the amount of work they thought I had to do when I was reading English, because they would say, oh, you just have to sit down and read a novel. You don't have to do much else than that, which to a point was true. But, they were quite big novels, and there were lots of them, and you had to think about them a bit and write about them a bit. And clearly, if you didn't do any of that, you weren't going to pass. So, it wasn't a summer holiday from start to finish. But I think compared to some degrees, I used to look at some of my contemporaries who did some of the science subject or maybe a math subject, and I think they probably worked harder than I did. But I did all right. And I think I got the balance right between doing the work I had to do and having a thoroughly good time, because my days as a student were very good days, and I'm very glad I kind of lived them as I did.
I think that's been the same with, especially who we've been speaking to, and that there is kind of this line to walk between enjoying it and also getting the work done, and trying not to get too distracted with everything that goes on around that age. So was that when you were in college? You studied English. Was it English just literature or language when you were there?
Well, it was mostly literature. There was a little bit of language, I think, in year 1, if I remember rightly, which was interesting actually, because I've always been interested in the actual sort of way in which the language grew and developed and changes and all those kinds of things. So we did a little bit of that. But it was mostly literature. So yeah, I've read most of the Shakespeare plays, and I've read nearly all the Dickens novels and all the other things that go with that. And I mean, I enjoyed them simply because I love reading and I love the stories. But I think it's when you look back at it, you realize the other things that those kinds of courses taught you that you perhaps didn't necessarily realize it at the time, in terms of the stories they tell of the era and the history and the attitudes and all the other things that were sort of built into those books that you may not have picked up on there and then. And I do occasionally go back and reread some of the things that I particularly enjoyed back then.
Yeah, do you find that?
For pleasure?
Because I know for me, I mean, doing something like A-level, I did A-level English literature, but you do kind of, I think you can appreciate it a bit more when you can go back and you can read it without having to analyse every other word to it. Yeah. Are you still reading like literature now, or is it just kind of, do you view it as work still, or just almost entertainment?
No, I mean, I read anyway fiction fairly regularly, and I enjoy it, and that's a random selection of fiction. There's no particular one type that I would go for, but just occasionally I think to myself, it would be really nice to go back to one of those classics and read it again, or even one of the ones I've never read. I did go back about, I think it was last year, maybe still sort of COVID pandemic time, and I loved the literature of Thomas Hardy, even though they're relentlessly bleak and depressing and nothing ever goes right for anybody in them. But there's one particular novel of his, The Mayor of Casterbridge, which I have always loved. I don't know why, it just sort of captured my imagination the first time I read it. And I must have read it 3 or 4 times, and I hadn't read it for a long time. And I suddenly thought, I really fancy reading that again. And I literally did it in a couple of days. And everything that each page turn reminded me as to why I liked it so much the first time round. So I think it's quite a pleasure to do that. And as you say, you're not taking notes. You're not thinking, what's the essay I've got to write on this subject when I finish reading it? You're just reading it because it's a very good story. And it is.
Is it mostly reading then, or do you try like audiobooks? Because I'm kind of got the opinion of audiobooks. I can't really enjoy the book, or like, I think podcasts I prefer over like audiobooks, but when it comes to reading, I think it's better to just have it on paper to read.
Is it more classical, so sort of the traditional style of reading, or do you often?
No, it varies. But I think, the audiobook thing is interesting, I think, because you're right. If it's a classic piece of literature, I would tend to prefer to read it off the page. Sometimes something autobiographical, where as you read it, particularly if it's a current figure who's still alive and whose voice you are familiar with for other reasons, if you hear their words as they read it out loud in an audiobook, I think that's often quite potent. I've heard Stephen Fry, for example, reading things that he has written, and the fact that he is reading it really brings it to life. I recently read Miriam Margolyes's autobiography, and I read it, but then I heard her reading it. Because she has this amazing voice and is so sort of vital and funny and all the things that we know she is. The fact that she read those words, I think, again, brought that to life as well. So when it's autobiographical, I think the audio book is quite a nice option.
I might have to try that, because I've got probably about 30 pages left. I'm reading Martin O'Neill's autobiography, because obviously being a Villa fan, and seeing him, succeed there, and seeing the kind of success they're going through at the moment, I thought, I'll pick that up and have a read of it. And I didn't realise how good, because I only caught on, when you come to Aston Villa, I think I was probably 12, 13, if that, at that age, when you got to Aston Villa, and seeing the kind of, you can kind of look back and see it at different ages. So like I've always held him as like probably one of the best managers Villa has ever had. But you see it, and then you look back at like his past, going through Nottingham Forest and everything. But I've never thought about that, reading the audio book and hearing him, because I think he reads it. So do you get like a different perspective?
I think you do get a different perspective. Yeah, sometimes when you read the words, you can hear the voice of the person who's written it anyway. But of course, that's added to 10 times over when you do actually hear the voice of the person who's read it. And I can imagine somebody like Martin O'Neill, you would sort of sense his voice as you read it. So, yeah, you should give it a go. I'd imagine he has voiced it himself, knowing him. He's not shy and retiring. I'd have thought he probably would.
No, he's a busy man. He's always a busy man.
And I guess, going down sort of the English route, what got you into radio? Because, obviously you taught us in first year very much sort of TV, radio. Did you always want to get into radio? Was it TV or print or?
I knew I wanted to be a journalist. I love the written word. So I loved words and I loved stories. But I hadn't quite sort of formulated a proper plan beyond that. And it was towards the end of my second year as an English student that obviously the inevitable conversations began, where you get summoned to meet somebody in the careers department and they say, what do you want to do with the rest of your life? And by then I was beginning to come down the road that I was in. But I have to say, I mean, I loved the University of Leicester with all my heart, but their careers department was frankly pretty useless, particularly on this subject. In fact, I do remember going in and saying, look, I've decided I want to go into journalism. What do I need to do between now and then to make that slightly more likely? And the response I got back, which was admittedly slightly tongue-in-cheek, was, well, pray, because it was very competitive. Yeah. And I said, well, what happens if you don't believe in God? To which there was a sort of stunned silence. So I didn't find that terribly helpful. But after that not very useful conversation, I started to dig around a little bit more. And back then, because we're talking the mid-1980s, there were far fewer courses like the ones we all know here existing then than do now. But there were one or two postgraduate options that were journalism, but they weren't necessarily broadcast journalism. And I plumped for several to see what would come back. And the one that did come back was the one in Falmouth in Cornwall, which was geared to radio journalism. And I managed to get a place on that course. So that was the deciding factor, really. I hadn't necessarily set out to be radio, but radio was the one that came good. So radio was the direction I went in, which I'm looking back very glad I did.
Which one do you enjoy more? Is there anyone that you
radio
enjoy?
Without doubt. Radio without doubt.
Okay.
I think it's easier, or just enjoy the
I don't think it's easy. In
communication?
fact, I think it's actually harder to do well. But I think, having done both, having started in radio and then edged into television and ended up doing both, I think the great thing about radio is that it's immediate, it's intimate, it's in some ways, if it's done really well, the pictures are sometimes better because they allow the imagination of the person listening to be led down particular paths. The problem for television with me sometimes, not always, but it is a much more complicated medium. It involves far more people. And I think sometimes, particularly in the sort of the world of news, that complication can get in the way of a straightforward telling of a story. If you watch a typical news bulletin on television now, incredible amounts of technological advancement now means that they can do all manner of incredibly clever things to put on the screen at the same time as the journalism is there. And sometimes that helps, but sometimes people get so excited about the fact that they can do all of that stuff that they do all of it, and then it gets in the way.
Too much of a good thing,
it
really.
Can be too much of a good thing, whereas I think radio just has that clear way of communicating. It's just the human voice. It's just dependent on written words, people who can narrate, people who can communicate. And if they do it well, I think it can still captivate.
Do you prefer like kind of the live radio that's saying like, BBC radio, 5, whatever, or do you prefer like the pre-recorded podcast episodes where they can, you go into, I mean, they don't have to, but I know a lot of the bigger podcasts, they can go for an hour, 2 hours, even 3 hours sometimes. Would you prefer to like listen to a deep dive in a podcast that's 3 hours, or just kind of the current event live, see what, the public has to say and do it live?
Well, I mean, most of my broadcasting over the years has been live, so I suppose that's what I'm most used to and what I most enjoy, because it's just a bit more, it's a bit more dangerous, isn't it? It's a bit riskier. You don't know what's going to happen or what somebody is about to say. And while that clearly has its disadvantages on a few rare occasions when things get on the air that shouldn't, by and large, it just keeps everybody on their toes a little bit more. And I love that sense of spontaneity and unpredictability that live radio brings you. And that's not to say that there aren't some fantastic podcasts out there that are telling some amazing stories, and when they're put together and they're well edited and everything, they're a really, really good listen. But they're not quite the same edge of the seat stuff that live radio is, because you do not know what is coming next.
So going back, so you get to the Falmouth. So you get there. How old are you when you get there?
I was, 21 when I got there and 22 when I left.
Did you hit the ground running with radio work then, or did it still take a bit of getting used to
I was
and
quite
understanding
lucky.
it all?
I was quite lucky actually, because while I was there, the Falmouth course was changing almost sort of in front of your eyes. It had been run by somebody whose background wasn't really in broadcasting, and the course was considered to be sort of losing its way a little bit. But he left during the summer after I got the place. So by the time I joined the course, it was going in a very different direction and a much better direction. And I got the chance to go and do a few reporting shifts at the commercial local radio station that was then in Exeter in Devon, called Devon Air, long since disappeared off the map. And then towards the end of that year, there was a chance to do a 3-week placement at a local radio station of your choice, well, up to a point, your choice. And I asked if I could go back to my university city, which was Leicester, to work at the BBC local radio station in Leicester. And I asked because it struck me as being sensible, if you could, to go to a place where you actually knew the geography and had a sense of the place a little bit. Because if you were going to be a reporter and you might be sent out to wherever, you didn't really want to get lost, because that wouldn't be a good look as a student. And fortunately, I got a place there for 3 weeks. And the great thing about those 3 weeks, and this was, again, totally good fortune, was that the news editor at that time at Radio Leicester was a fairly new, fairly young, so he had a quite positive attitude towards students, where some radio stations back then frankly didn't. And the likes of the three of us might arrive at a radio station in those circumstances, and a rather sort of grumpy, curmudgeonly news editor might sit you in the corner with the newspapers and a cup of tea and not give you any work. So you weren't in a position to prove whether you could do it or not. Fortunately, I went to one where you were given the chance. He took a kind of sort of sink or swim attitude. He gave you the work, and if it went well, great. If it didn't, okay, well, you'd at least tried. Unfortunately, my 3 weeks went well. And off the back of those 3 weeks, he didn't offer me a job straight away, but he did offer me the promise of freelance work in the ensuing summer and into the autumn, and that became a contract, and then that eventually became a job.
So you went back home and worked there for a little bit. Did you end up going back to uni to finish the course, or was it like a work experience in between, like a year, not a gap year, but like a kind of summer internship kind of thing in between your radio course?
Well, the placement at Leicester was towards the end of my 1 year at Falmouth anyway. So yes, I did go back to Falmouth just for the last, I think, through a month maybe of the course, because you had to take your exams and all of that, which I did. And then I'd already decided at that point that I'd take advantage of what had happened in Leicester and I'd go back there. So I moved to Leicester in the summer. And as I say, then I started pursuing the freelance work, and that sort of blossomed from there. So that was that was the summer of 1985.
What journalism was you doing there? Was it like political journalism, or just anything they threw at you just to get experience?
Anything they threw at you. I mean, the great thing about a local radio newsroom is that even back, it's far more understaffed now, but even back then there were only relatively few of you. So if you were on one of the day reporter shifts, you would literally walk in. And there'd be a meeting at about sort of 9:30 in the morning, and stories would be handed out and assigned. And if it involved going out and interviewing people, off you went. And obviously, if something broke during the day, then you might have to change tack. So it really was anything that happened to happen that day.
I mean, was there any topics that you certainly didn't like reporting on?
Well, I suppose there are always some that you find more exciting than others. I mean, back then, it doesn't happen now because there aren't enough people to do it, but back then you used to fairly regularly have to go and sit through an entire council meeting, whether it was a county council meeting or a Leicester City Council meeting. And at the time, Leicestershire County Council was one of these councils where no one party had overall control, which meant nobody ever agreed on anything, and the meetings lasted forever. And I remember going to one where they were setting the annual rate for the next year, and it took 8 hours, and I sat through the entire thing. So quite a lot of us took a bit of persuading when it came to being sent to council meetings. But it was part of the job at the time. So that was probably one of the ones that I didn't relish as much as others.
I mean, I guess, were you always kind of even growing up doing the English course, going back to that, with like the higher idea of like politics and kind of being interested in that still in your mind, or would that only just come when you was given the opportunity to literally, go out, report on the story, go into that? Was that something that just kind of blossomed as you did more work, or was it always kind of in the back of your mind?
No, I think I was always interested in politics and what made things tick in this country and beyond. Under that heading, I mean, I was 16 when Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister. So you became very aware of a lot of the sort of quite radical political goings-on that happened back then. And in 1982, when I was a student, the Falklands War took place. And again, I can remember lots and lots of sort of debate and argument when I was a student about the rights and wrongs of all of that. And in 1983, you had a general election in this country where the left completely split because of elements within the Labour Party that was sort of taking that party in a different direction. So all of that, yeah, I think it did prompt debate and discussion, and I took a keen interest in it. So yeah, I've always followed politics quite closely, even from my sort of teenage years.
I mean, that would be very. I mean, obviously, we never lived through it, obviously, but I mean, by the sound of it, and like, you can speak to anybody, and everybody will have a different opinion on what happened. There's no kind of natural consent. I know there's no natural consensus in politics anyway, but I always feel like within that 10, 15 years.
I think Margaret Thatcher was one of these figures. She was described as divisive on the day that she died, and people, talking about her legacy during that sort of subsequent week or so, because I was actually on the air when she died and had to announce it to the Radio 4 audience. And there was no doubt that people either practically worshipped at her feet or just could not stomach her at all, or what she stood for. So when you'd got that right, really quite strong feelings, those strong feelings on either side, I think a lot of people were drawn into politics who perhaps otherwise wouldn't have been. So it was quite a political time, I think, in this country, because she naturally sparked debate about politics in a way that perhaps others hadn't.
You even just go on YouTube today and you can see some of the debates she's had. They still get millions of views.
Yeah.
Even today.
Yeah.
So you was live when you announced that? Was that during when you was also doing TV, or had you just still on radio at that point?
Well, I was doing both at the time, I think, and it was a weekday lunchtime. And I'm struggling to think which year it was.
2013?
That sounds about right. And I was presenting You and Yours on Radio 4, which is their lunchtime consumer program. And it was coming just towards the end of the program. So we had literally about sort of 2 or 3 minutes left on air. And somebody flashed either in my ear or put something on the screen in front of me to the effect that she had died. And it was left to me to announce it and then sort of take us to the end of the program. And then obviously it was covered extensively on the 1 o'clock news on Radio 4, which followed me. So yes, that was one of those sort of gulp moments where you think, oh, yeah, this is a big deal. I better make sure I get this right, which fortunately I did.
No, it is 2013. It's only been 10 years. 8th of April.
I thought it was
that sounds about right. Wow. I'm entirely trusting you on
Wow.
that.
So, I mean, going back to that then, so I guess that goes back to a previous point where we said that, the whole idea of having the radio live is a bit more dangerous. You have to adapt to those things quickly. Was that literally just your job at that point? Obviously, because you said you was coming towards the end of the show, it was literally just, right, say it and you're off. Do you almost, from a journalist perspective, and even from a personal perspective, I guess, you announce that story, do you almost kind of want to stay on air and you kind of follow it further live rather than just, you've announced it, you've ran it to the finish line, and then you hand the baton to somebody else to cross the line? Would you prefer, if you could, obviously, time can't do that half the time, would you like to have stopped on and been able to carry that story further?
Yeah, I know what you mean, and I think the truthful answer is that most of us who do what I do for a living, we quite like the moments that we happen to be on the air when something big happens, and we quite like to sort of curate it and look after it and be there for for as long as we can within reason, and hopefully do a decent job in the process. So yeah, I think we all like those moments. And going to my sort of television days, working on the news channel, the 24-hour news channel on the BBC, as I did for a good few years. It was quite often the case that you happened to be on the air when a big story broke, and you came off the air and you did have a kind of sort of buzz afterwards, because your adrenaline flows and you're sort of there's all sorts of things running around in your head and instructions in your ear, and that sense of uncertainty, but at the same time trying to stay calm and measured through the process. So yeah, I think we all enjoy that, and we all enjoy the chance when it comes our way.
So just going back then, so you're running around like a madman trying to get stories for a local radio. How long was it between you doing that to then what kind of sparked the idea of, okay, let's dabble in a bit of TV? Did someone introduce you to it, or was it just like the gradual process? Because I think, is it Mark Chapman, the one that does he does a lot of the football podcasts. I watched an interview with him, and he said, like, if you nail radio, it's kind of easier then to kind of step into the world of TV, because you're often staring down the barrel of a TV camera. Is it easier to start with radio? And then when did you see your position changing to say, okay, let's try TV now, let's move on and try something different?
Yeah, I mean, it was very gradual, and it was a bit sort of piecemeal in my case, because I'd been working at the local radio station in Leicester for about 3 years, I think, as a reporter, producer, occasionally reading the news, occasionally presenting programs there. And the opportunity to move into TV journalism reporting came along. And it just felt like the right time to try, although I know at the back of my mind I wasn't entirely convinced that it was the right thing to do, but you got that sense that there were people above who were sort of looking over you thinking, I think you ought to give this a go. So I did. And I went to work in Birmingham and Nottingham for 6 months as a reporter-presenter. And it's probably the 6 months of my career that I least enjoyed. I didn't do it terribly, but I didn't do it particularly well. And I just, at that point in time, I mean, what was I, 25, 26? I just didn't feel very comfortable on the television compared with the radio. And I very quickly came to the conclusion that I wanted to get back into radio, which is what I ended up doing. I was very fortunate that the job that came my way after that took me back to the local radio station in Leicester, but in charge of the newsroom as the news editor, rather than one of the people who was sort of reporting. And I was very lucky to get that job. I was quite young to get it, I guess. But it took me back to radio. It took me back to the place I liked geographically as well. So having done that, I then kept away from television for a good long time after that, because I felt as if I'd had my fingers burnt. And it was years later, I think it was 2003 maybe. 2003. I'd just finished presenting the 5 Live breakfast show for 4.5 years. And the chance to initially join BBC Three when it launched, and then the news channel came along. And because of my previous experience on the television, which I was still slightly wary of, I always said, okay, I'll do it and I'll have another go and I will get better and I'll get some better training, all of which happened. But I'll do it as well as radio and never instead of. And I've always stuck to that. So even when I was doing the news channel quite a lot, I always had radio going on at the same time.
Yeah, so they wasn't kind of independent of each other; they were always kind of parallel.
But I think Mark Chapman is right that if you can nail radio, I'm not sure anybody ever fully nails radio, but
I can try.
I know what he means. If you can get radio pretty much right and you feel happy with it, I think your chances of making television work are significantly higher. Yeah.
Do you think that? I mean, that kind of interests me because obviously we're all sitting here now, and it's easy to do. I mean, do you think it is because it's on your shoulders? You're the front. You are the one in front of the camera. Do you think it's because you're a bit more not isolated, but you're on your own? You're dealing with the problems as they fall to you. I mean, I guess to a certain extent you're still doing that with radio anyway, especially when you're live. But do you think it is just an added bit of pressure doing it on TV, or does the pressure kind of bring more excitement with it?
I think it's to do with, I think it's a personality thing to an extent. One of the great things about doing, for example, I mentioned it a moment ago, doing Five Live Breakfast, which I did for 4.5 years. It was a popular program and it was a successful program, and we won awards for it, and all of that was great. But what I loved about that was that you could walk out of the building when you'd finished a program, and you could walk back into the street and walk back to wherever you were going, bus stop, tube station, whatever, back home. And you might walk past somebody who was listening to you that morning, and they wouldn't have the first idea who you were. So you could just blend back into a totally anonymous existence, and I rather like that. I think some people on the telly really like the fact that they are recognised and recognisable, and people stop them and ask them for autographs and all that kind of stuff. I never really liked any of that very much. I mean, not that I'm kidding myself into thinking that when you're on the news channel, many people are going to stop you because they probably weren't watching. But on the rare occasions that they did, it was flattering, of course it was, but what it reminded you of was that fact that perhaps you haven't got your privacy to the level that you previously had. Some people like that. I was never quite so convinced that I did. So I think that's one of the reasons that I preferred radio to telly, because radio, you could satisfy the egotistical side of your nature, which you presumably had, otherwise you wouldn't be on the radio at all. But you could then just blend into nowhere straight after you'd finished it, whereas on the telly you felt that people had a little bit more of a sort of a piece of you, which I was never that excited
Yeah, you're offering
about.
more of yourself.
Yeah.
Off in terms of, visual
Yeah.
representation.
I mean, I remember years back in regional telly, there was a woman who will remain nameless, who used to complain constantly that she couldn't go to her local supermarket because, she was forever walking down the aisle and being stopped by people saying, "Oh, I loved you on this and I loved you on that." And she would portray this as some sort of, state of affairs that she was frustrated by, when you knew damn well that she loved it. And that was part of her. And she, it's not a criticism, but it's just that, she was made that way and I'm not.
Yeah, I think in a weird way that exists even more so today, doesn't it? Especially when you've got things like social media and like Instagram. People go, they put photos, pictures of themselves on, but in a weird way they kind of love the reactions from it, even though they might not say they like it, but I think there is that kind of, I guess, like you say, it is ego, isn't it? Deep down kind of ego of, I'm not saying that every TV presenter's this egotistical maniac running around, but I do think there must be something in that of promoting yourself and doing it that way. So how long did you how long was you doing TV for? Like, what was your main kind of not on screen years, but what was your kind of main time on news?
Well, in the end, I did it in two sort of quite long periods of time, because I joined the news channel, never full time, but I joined it and became a sort of fairly regular face on it from about the sort of second half of 2003 for about 4 years. Then I stopped every bit of media work for 6 months and travelled around the world because I had a little sort of escape period. And then I came back and rejoined the news channel and carried on working there from 2008 on and off for more than the next 10 years, actually. So I did it for a long time.
I mean, from going back to the beginning, there must be quite a bit of because we're only caught the tail end of this, I think, but there must be a lot of technological change throughout probably even as silly as it sounds, from when you took your 6-month hiatus, and how drastically has, from you beginning to today, the technology has changed? Because I mean, even going back to that point, you running around getting stories, sitting in meetings all day, how major has it been a change in even just presenting and either just radio and I guess more TV? How big has the change been?
Yeah,
introducing all this new technology,
but also with the BBC as a whole. I mean, they've embraced so much new technology. They've got BBC Sounds, all these intricate sort of investments in future technologies. I mean, just how have you seen it? Because you've probably seen from the advent of the internet all the way to now. I mean, surely for you must have seen pretty much everything, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's going back to 1985 when I first joined local radio. Nothing digital existed at all. So everything you recorded was on a reel-to-reel tape recorder where you watched the great big reels of tape going round and round, and you edited things with razor blades and pencils and sticky tape. So any of the kit that now sits in front of us didn't exist. So radio studios looked very different from how they do now. So that side of it clearly has totally changed. And the number of outlets, the things that people could either listen to or watch back then was tiny compared with now. I mean, when I joined Radio Leicester in 1985, there were only four. There were 4 national TV channels available because you had BBC 1 and 2, ITV and Channel 4, and that was it, nothing else. Wow. And on the radio, national commercial radio didn't really exist. There were local commercial stations, nothing national. And the BBC coverage of the country was tiny compared with now. So all of that gradually grew, obviously. But I think the biggest change of all is to a degree technological, because it is related. You mentioned the internet. It's related to the internet. But the advent of initially emails and then the wider use of the internet, and then the arrival of the mobile phone and the text message, and then social media, what that all has done is it's entirely changed the relationship between those of us who are on the air and the people who are consuming it. Because there's a sudden, immediate sense of communication between those two different elements. I mean, if I was on the radio in the late 90s and I said something that really annoyed people, I might get a letter 3 days later from a very angry listener. Yeah. By which
You're talking from experience there.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. By which time, the moment had kind of passed to a degree. Whereas if within seconds you read something online that tells you what they think of you and do so in no uncertain terms, then it's a very different kind of dynamic, I think.
Do you think it changes the job then if you're able to, obviously, I mean, I don't think we're going to be able to do this in kind of, even if you don't stop within the news or journalism, the whole idea of like being able to switch off from work, put your phone down, turn it off, you know what I mean? You finish at 6 o'clock or 7, you finish at 6 o'clock and 7, you don't worry about anything till you get in at 8 o'clock the next morning. Do you think it kind of affects the way in which you do, not like, do I think it affects the way you do your job? Do you think it has an impact on that if you're constantly, I mean, even as far back as not as far back, you look at like a newspaper, you get the news once, twice, maybe 3 times a day. Now it's like, stories just broke here. You've got another story here. You've got another story over here. Oh, someone else has commented on this. Do you think that kind of makes the broadcasting and things different and not more difficult, but it's a lot more to take in, especially from like your perspective as a presenter?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I think, you are constantly, whether you want to be or not, you are now constantly in touch with every major international development 24 hours a day, simply because your phone tells you about it. Obviously, you could set it not to do that, but it would be an odd thing for me to do, given what I do for a living. But I must confess that doesn't bother me unduly, because I always had the appetite to know. I mean, when the phone buzzes at me and announces a bit of breaking news, I don't regard that as work. I regard it as something that I would be interested in, even if I didn't do that for a living. So that doesn't bother me so much. In many ways, I think it's a good thing rather than a bad thing. In fact, I struggle to think back to how on earth we operated back in the sort of late 80s, early 90s, when none of that existed. So a news story might break, and I would have no reason to know about it for hours, because there was no mechanism whereby you could be told. So I might walk in to do the breakfast programme in Leicester in 1987, for sake of argument, and until I walked in and the machine in the corner of the room started churning out bits of material that came up from London the previous night, I would have no way of knowing what had just gone on for the previous sort of 7 or 8 hours. So there was a moment of exciting discovery, but it also meant that you were having to play catch-up in terms of how you then covered it.
Yeah, constantly. Yeah, you're waiting for it to hit you rather than it just appeering in front of you. Well, it still does appear, but not as quickly or as anything. Do you feel that, like, when it comes to, kind of, you look at stuff like, Twitter and everything now with, the news is constantly coming out on there. Do you think it's a good idea that the way they hold it, how can I put this? Try to word it. You know, when they ask like questions between journalists, go deep dive and they research things in intent. Even though you look at the Twitter files or something that happened recently, do you think it is good having more kind of like independent journalists being able to research and things? Because I mean, probably in the BBC and things, you don't just stick to the main stories, but there are a lot of main stories which take up obviously a lot of your time. Do you think it is good having that kind of, ability to allow individuals who you're not, working with to research things which you don't have the time to? Do you think that's overall beneficial, even if it might be angled a different way, or, it might not be 100% of the truth? Do you think it's better having that ability now you've got the use of the internet?
Yeah, I do, because I think, the breadth of stories that are going to be covered and investigated and told is going to be broader, and that's got to be a good thing. The only sort of worry that you always have is the fact that people have got to be in a position where they can sort of find the wood for the trees when it comes to the stuff they can trust and the stuff they are not so sure about. And I think one of the problems that we have in this day and age is that there is so much now out there that a lot of probably not a lot of people, but a significant group of people either are not sufficiently clued up to judge what's reliable and what isn't, or they will actively set out not to ever hear anything other than the point of view that they have already adopted in life, whether that's reliable or not. And that's why you end up in this situation where lots of nonsense is spouted, lots of untruths are told, and nobody is prepared to countenance the fact that they might be wrong in those situations. And I think that's potentially quite unhealthy, and you see it playing out now all over the globe in various parts of the world. And I don't know what the answer to it is, but I think it is potentially quite dangerous if we don't keep a close eye on it.
I think a lot of people do. People get stuck in echo chambers, don't they? Where they don't, they just stuck with ideas and beliefs that is reinforced by someone over here, and they hear it all. They go over here and they hear it again. Do you spend a lot of time on scrolling through Twitter and the news and things, or do you limit your own personal impact on it?
I do limit it. I tend not to follow Twitter too closely if I possibly can, for exactly the reasons we've just talked about. And I do have a little rule that says, I might read one newspaper that I'm thinking, I'm probably more in line with this newspaper in terms of what I might be thinking about an array of topics. But to avoid getting lazy and to avoid the echo chambers that you were just talking about, I will normally in those circumstances think, right, okay, that's what this paper is saying. What about the one that I know doesn't agree with it? And I just occasionally would pick the other one up and think, oh, okay, so that's the other point of view. And I think, the BBC has critics for all manner of reasons, and some of them are probably quite justified. But one of the things that it does constantly set out to do, and never always reliably, but it does set out to do, is that sense that, there is normally more than one side to a story, and however uncomfortable one side might be over the other, in my own personal opinion, which doesn't count for a row of beans, it's still important to put it out there. And I think that the media organisations that continue to do that, and I think we're very lucky in this country that still the mainstream broadcast media has to adhere to a set of rules whereby that is done by and large. It's important that that's there, because it runs as a counter to some of the echo chambers online that would never conceive of seeking a viewpoint that isn't the one that they know everybody wants to hear.
I think a lot of it's perspective, isn't it? You need a wide range of different a lot of them. I always think sometimes, even if you're just speaking with people, talking about, it doesn't have to be news related topics, it can just be anything. I always think it can be interesting, even if you completely disagree with them, if they can reinforce their point and give you an honest argument which they back, and they can not convince you but provide you with a solid argument, I think you're more likely to engage in that talk and communicate better, rather than just reading everything you see online. What would you say is a way to even stop it though? I mean, you look at the rise of AI and things now. How does that work? Because I mean, I've seen it a lot recently going around. You look at that Chat GPT, 4's coming out soon. I mean, a lot of the argument. Have you seen they did it for ChatGPT? The Dan, did you hear where it's like do anything now? And literally, what it is, there is no kind of limit or kind of hold on it. It will do anything if it can make a joke, which it wouldn't normally make, or can do something which it shouldn't normally do. But then people argue, oh well, you have to put limits on it, but who's putting the limits on it? How, from your like a journalist perspective, that get news in that's not biased, and then you sit there and look at it and have to get that from an objective perspective, how do you then look for like the companies that probably do have they've all got shareholders to look after and things like that? How do you then? What would you do if you was made king of the world tomorrow, and you said, right, you got to deal with AI and this perspective of it all? How do people go about monitoring that?
Well, you can't stop that kind of progress and technological advancement, and you can't stop the big money and the corporate element that will play a part in a large pluralist media landscape, because that's part of it. But what I think you can do if you're running a country, any country, is put your political backing behind the elements of public service media and broadcasting that should still have a part to play in that landscape. I think the problems arise when our political leaders of whatever political colour start to either withdraw their backing for public service broadcasting, or they deliberately underfund it. So they allow the market to take over too much. And then you're left in a situation where nobody's quite sure what they can believe, because there isn't some kind of mechanism in the middle that offers people at least a chance to dip into something which would be regarded as, quote, mainstream. So I think the political leaders all over the world, in the democratic countries that they're running, are, I think the onus is on them to back the public service element of the media landscape, and that doesn't stop the rest of it flourishing in the way that it does, but you need to have that foundation around which other things can operate as well, I think.
Do you think it'll affect the way the news is presented then? Like, I mean, we've laughed and joked, off of this. We said, have you seen those where it's like you've got Donald Trump, you've got Joe Biden and Obama playing Minecraft together and things like that. It's just all AI produced voices and songs. Do you think that could ever seep into or kind of like have an impact on the way the news is kind of presented? Or do you think having a real world person sitting there receiving the news as it comes in, will that just always be a lot more beneficial than just some voice reading the news?
It's hard to look into the future like that, because you can clearly technologically now it's more than possible to have some robotic figure who looks like a newsreader reading you the news. In fact, I think it was done on screen only a few months back was it Dubai? I can't remember. Anyway, somewhere recently, where this robot looked incredibly convincing. So there's a risk of that, but. I don't know. I don't know what the future holds, and I don't think many leaders around the world are. They've got plenty of other things to worry about. So I suspect this isn't necessarily top of their priority list. But it is something that I think needs to be looked at, because there's a danger that we take our eye off that particular ball, and we end up in a situation where people don't really think they can believe much, if anything, of what is put in front of them. And if you end up with that level of distrust, then that's not healthy for anything, it seems to me.
But also, I mean, am I right in saying that you used to and still train journalists at the BBC?
I do, yeah.
I mean, how does that work? Do you sort of teach them to embrace this technology in a positive way, or, how does that work?
Well, most of the training I do at the BBC is relating to how we interview people. So to an extent, I can steer clear of the technology, because I still think, and I would argue that this is true of, some of the most advanced sources of media in this day and age are still, it seems to me, reliant on some basic skills that you've got to be able to write, and you've got to be able to broadcast in a way that people will find engaging. And if you're asking questions, you've got to be able to do it in a way that means that you sound informed, that you ask the kinds of questions that people want to hear the answers to, and you listen, and all the other things that I probably bored you both with when we were doing classes together. So those skills, I don't think those skills change. So when I'm doing my BBC training, I'm still going back over that kind of ground, and I leave the technology for other people to worry about.
Okay.
So what made, going back to what seems like a long conversation ago, what made you go from doing the TV to then, I know, so you went from radio, TV, back to radio, did a bit more TV, back to radio once again. What made you go, okay, time to teach? Was it just that you wanted to kind of give something back? Was it just, or different new opportunity, try new waters, see what works?
I think the teaching side of things dates back a long time ago, actually, because when I was even a local radio news editor, so still in my late 20s, I was occasionally invited by the BBC then training department to go and talk to groups of people who were joining local radio for the first time, because I think they felt that there might be a connection between me still at that point being in my late 20s and these newbies coming in who weren't that much younger than me. So I started doing that, and I used to quite enjoy it, and they seemed to like it. So I sort of latched onto that from quite an early stage, and I always kept that part of my working life sort of bubbling along, even though I couldn't necessarily pursue it too often. But as the BBC developed its training in a bit more sophisticated of a way, and they ended up creating the BBC Academy, I immediately took an interest in what they did and did some work with them. And that led to a series of courses that I used to run and one-to-one training sessions that I did then and still do now. And I do find it very rewarding. So I suppose there is a little bit of giving something back. But I enjoy doing it. And most of the time when I've done it, people seem to like it. And there is something immensely satisfying. I mean, looking back to some of the sessions that the two of you worked on with me.
Hopefully that wasn't too bad.
No, that was good. No, I enjoyed those. But I mean, the great satisfaction from my point of view in those kinds of sessions is that over a period of, well, I think it was 5 weeks, wasn't it, that we worked together. If you can look at somebody who in week one looks a little bit anxious, a little bit unsure, maybe doesn't contribute much, if anything, over the 3 hours that you're together. And inevitably, if you're standing where I am in that situation, you naturally form a whole array of quite quick judgments, opinions about people in the room and how they're behaving and how they're reacting and all that kind of stuff. And if you can do that in week one, and 5 weeks later you look at that same person and you can see that they have really come out of their shell and they're contributing more and they're clearly enjoying it and they're engaged and all that kind of thing, you can walk away from that 5 week period and think that is really satisfying, because you feel as if you've given that person at least the sort of the first step on the rung of the ladder, that's what I get out of it.
Yeah, so you've passed the message on, but you've also guided people to what they want to do, really, isn't it? I guess.
I mean, you give them a platform, don't you? Yeah. If they choose to then jump off the platform, that's their lookout. But you give them a chance to take it forward, I think.
So how long was it that you've, I know you said you've been teaching for throughout your kind of career, but do you say you're more just primarily teaching now? Is that what kind of the goal is for you moving forward, or just
no, it's still more broadcasting than teaching, but apart from the work I do here at City, I do some teaching at the University of West London as well, and I've done the odd one-off in various other places, plus the BBC Academy stuff that you mentioned, Manav, as well. So I keep all that bubbling along. I think for a long time now, in fact, ever since I came back from that sort of 6-month trip abroad when I didn't work at all, I took the view that the best way to try and continue my working existence was to have a number of different things on the go at any given moment, because it made life more interesting and more varied. But also in a purely practical way, it meant that it was unlikely that all of them would crash to the ground at the same time. So if one went pear-shaped, others would hopefully pick up the slack.
To be fair, we were on about this beforehand. I think I've found out since I'm doing, working outside of uni, doing work, setting this up. You're contacting people, they're responding to. Many people ignore you, whatever. I think you kind of get more motivated to want to keep doing more things, don't you? You're not just content with just doing one thing. You're like, okay, I've done this is working, and now let's try something different to keep it builds momentum. I think to keep doing new things.
Yeah, I think they call it a portfolio career. That's the modern parlance for it, and yeah, I like it. I think it's more interesting. Keeps you on your toes, as I say. Less chance of it all going wrong at the same time. So yeah, I'm a big fan of it.
But what made you think, from working for so long, what prompted you to go, right, I'm just not going to work? So, so this is 2007.
Yes, it was. Yeah. Well, I was, 44 years old. And I was kind of getting to the point, I was still at Radio 5 Live at the time. And I felt I'd done sort of pretty much everything that Radio 5 Live had to offer. And I'd had a fantastic sort of 13 years working at that station. And I was beginning to have that sort of slight thinking, that thought of, there's more to life. There's something else I want to be doing, and not to get away from broadcasting forever by any means, because I never intended that. But I sort of thought there's that sort of itch to go and see more of the world. And I started a plan, which I launched probably almost a year before I actually left, to prepare for the possibility of going away for 6 months, and leaving this country, renting out my home, and disappearing off and just seeing bits of the world I hadn't seen. So I did some training to teach English as a foreign language to get ready for using that possibility, which I did. And I resigned my job at the right moment. I spoke to everybody at the BBC who I worked for then and said, look, I'm going to come back 6 months from now. Can I still get some work when I do? And the answers were broadly positive. And they were true as well, as it turned out. And off I went. So I disappeared on the 1st of October 2007 and didn't come back until the 28th of March 2008. And it was without doubt, I think, probably the best thing I did as an adult.
I mean, what countries did you go? And obviously you mentioned foreign language, so I like learning languages. What languages did you pick up any?
I tried to learn Spanish. Because I spent 2 months of my 6 in South America, and I spent quite a long period of those 2 months in Argentina, which is where I'd signed up to do some voluntary teaching, which is where I used the teaching English as a foreign language. But also alongside that, I tried to do a crash course in learning Spanish, which was not a language I could speak at all before I left the country. I tried to teach myself a little bit. With various sort of bits of audio material in your ears, but there's only so far that will take you, it seemed to me. But that was good, and I lived with an Argentine family in Buenos Aires, whereby I basically had to speak it, although they occasionally let me off, because one of them could speak very good English, and I think after the second week, I remember, because we got to know each other better. And the woman in charge of the house, who was great, she was a teacher herself, she spoke quite good English. And one evening, it was just the pair of us in the flat, and she opened a bottle of Malbec and said that she was quite keen to improve her English, so now we were allowed to cheat. So I'm so relieved that finally I could speak a word of English. So that was great. And so the Spanish I have tried to keep up. Not very well, but I have tried to keep it up. But that's where I use the language skills. 2 months in South America, a bit in North America, States, Canada, and then towards the latter half of the 6 months, I was in Australia, New Zealand, and Southeast Asia.
What parts of Southeast Asia?
I went initially to Indonesia, specifically Bali, and then I went on to Singapore and Malaysia and Thailand.
Wow. Okay. But is that something that's really important to you, traveling? Do you still try and travel as much?
Yes, I think the thing with that particular thing is that you think you've scratched an itch by doing it, but all it really does is make you want to do it again. I haven't done it again, not certainly in that form, but I have travelled quite a lot since. I mean, I'd been lucky even by that moment to have travelled a great deal for work to places that I would not otherwise have gone. So it wasn't as if I was lacking in sort of international travel even then, but there were the things I wanted to do and see, which I did. But I have tried to travel to new places each year since, although inevitably, during COVID that didn't happen. But I still enjoy traveling.
I think it gives you a good perspective of everything that's going on, because rather than just, although you are you do the news, we try to keep a broad perspective thing. Do you think it kind of grounds everything and brings seeing the world for itself? It's not just this, political ideology. It's not just everything else around it. You get to see. I'm guessing you went around and saw like a lot of nature and things. Does that kind of ground your view of pretty much the world, isn't it? Really, it gives you that different perspective, which, although working hard gets you a good view of things and a good view of the world, do you think that perspective of removing yourself from everything, even if it's just for a short period of time, it is good to kind of reset and go,
Yeah, I think it's very important, actually. I mean, yeah, you're right. It's either nature, so you just see things that are just breathtaking simply because of how they look, or you see lives being led by people who are so far away from you in terms of their life's experience, that it just makes you sort of sit up and think about, in many cases, how fortunate you are because of the life that you happen to live. I remember one particular occasion in Lima in Peru, where a friend of mine from way back was working in a shanty town on the outskirts of Lima. So he was surrounded by people living in the most abject poverty. And to spend a day with him just sort of walking around the immediate area of where he was living and the work he was doing and meeting some of the people he was working with and the lives that they were leading, that inevitably you can't walk away from that kind of experience without it leaving a mark and making you think. And I think it's important that as many people as possible can do that, because, it's very easy to take for granted the fact that, for all its faults, we live in a country where, we are mostly leading lives which are reasonably comfortable. We are one of the richest countries on the globe, and occasionally to visit one that isn't and see the bottom end of that scale is very eye-opening.
What do you think then? I know you said you haven't gone travelling things, but what do you think your next steps are going to be? So you leave here today. Are you going to? Do you want to keep working for as long as you can? Do you want to keep doing broadcast and TV and teaching as long as you can keep doing it, or do you think at some point you'd like to just go, okay, I'm going to switch off the work mode now and just have a longer break?
Well, I probably work less now than I did, and that's no accident. I'm quite relaxed about that. I've always thought that I will carry on doing it while I still enjoy doing it and while people still employ me. Clearly they might not. I have just turned 60, and inevitably that's a moment when you sort of think, how much longer do I want to carry on doing this? And I've got contemporaries, people I've known since literally school days, in very different walks of life, who have just taken retirement and are sort of looking at me thinking, why are you still working? And I'm thinking, well, because I like it. So while that sentiment continues, then I will carry on doing it. But inevitably, there is a little bit of winding down going on in your head. I think mentally, as you reach certain sort of big birthdays in life, it does make you sort of think about how much longer you carry on doing things for. But I'm not about to hang up the microphone just yet.
You're not going to hang up the boots. You're going to keep going for a little while.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think there is a benefit, though, in keep doing things that you enjoy to do. I think it keeps the mind active as well. It keeps the mind active, but also it's something silly. It keeps the body active by going to work, doing things. It just keeps you busy and keeps you active, really, at the end of the day, doesn't it? I think everybody wants to live as healthily as they can. And nobody's under the illusion they're going to live forever. No. But if you want to, I think there is a way and keep working as hard as you can, or just enjoy as much as you can do. So if you was just look, just to kind of, I guess, not wrap it up, but my final point is, you look back now to when you started. You go back to, 16-year-old you sitting there going, I'm reading all this English literature. Where do I go now? What would you say kind of like your main, if you was to not boil it down, but your skills that you put it down, what are your main kind of skills that you've carried through? Is it a lot of discipline? Is it the motivation to just keep doing work? What would you say has been the main point that's like aided you through it all?
Well, I think there are a number of things. I think it's you've got to have you've got to be fortunate enough to have one or two skills that you can build on, whether that's to do with how you write or how you behave in terms of your sort of mental approach to sitting in front of a microphone. I'm lucky to be somebody who is quite good at staying calm when other people panic. That's just the way I'm made, and I think that's quite important if you're doing this for a living. So I've got that as a useful skill. Discipline, yes. I think you've got to have a sense of perspective about it. Some people take it probably too seriously, and I don't mean that I don't take it seriously, but you've got to occasionally get that perspective that says, actually, while this is important, it's not as important as quite a lot of other jobs that people do. It's not brain surgery, for example. So if it goes wrong, then forgive yourself and move on and go back in front of the microphone the next day and try and pretend that the previous day's disaster did not occur. You've got to have that level of perspective and accompany that with a sense of humour that accepts that it won't always be perfect. It will go wrong. There will be frustrations. But embrace the fact that it's unpredictable, that no 2 days are the same, that you're normally working with some great colleagues, and occasionally you will get the chance to see things and meet people because of the job you do that the vast majority of people listening to this would never have the opportunity to do. And I think remembering that is really important.
Got any final questions to round it
No,
off?
I mean, I think we could keep going for a few more hours if we really wanted to. But no, I think thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's been a real honour talking to you.
I mean, yeah, we know you're a busy man, always constantly working, but I think it's good to sit down with somebody that, you know, has been through it all and has got stories to tell, but also, you know, we've said it, you've taught us, you've kind of guided us in the way at the beginning of it, and I think being able to sit down and learn more is just constantly beneficial to continue on the path that we want to go. So yeah, I just want to say thank you for doing this, and yeah.
Well, good luck as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you.